All right. Lawrence Swartz of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia will introduce our next panel. Thank you for finding a seat quickly.
Thank you, Bill, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you here today at the WACA conference. This panel is entitled Averting a Fourth Taiwan Strait Crisis. As we look around the world, many of our attentions have been pulled over towards Ukraine and Russia, but we are all still watching, waiting, studying, and learning about the challenges around Taiwan and China's relationship. Sometimes these conversations can feel like they're filled with doom and gloom, but I'd like to focus on the word averting a crisis in Taiwan. And we've got a panel of experts that are going to help us unpack how we might be able to do just that. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests here today. Rod Lee is the Director of Research at the China Aerospace Studies Institute. In addition, we have Andrew Scobell, who's a Distinguished Fellow for China at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He serves also as a Professor of Asian Studies at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Our discussion today will be moderated by Bob Sutter, who's a Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Gentlemen, we have about an hour for this discussion, and I leave the panel to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand you can hear me. I hope so. And this is a great pleasure for us to be here and to share with you our views on this very important issue. And so, without further ado, we're going to first ask Rod to offer his presentation. And we're all looking at different dimensions. And then Andrew will follow, and I will be third with some remarks as well. So, Rod, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Bob, and it's a pleasure to be here. So let me get right to the question about averting a Taiwan Strait crisis. And unfortunately, I think my response is going to be a combination of both the doom and gloom that we're trying to avoid, but also a little bit of optimism. But let's first try to answer the question, can we avert one? And the short answer is yes. If the United States decides to withdraw from the Asia Pacific and sort of resign itself to not come to Taiwan's aid in the event that mainland China decides to take over Taiwan, we're going to avert one, right? Like, the inherent answer to that question is yes. I think the more important, I'm being facetious, of course, but the more important question I think we should be asking is, what can we do to try to avert that crisis while also maintaining U.S. interests in sort of strategic objectives in the region? So with that framework in mind, let's take a step back and establish what national objectives are on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side, because I think that's a very important framework to understand why a crisis might or might not occur. So let's first look to the U.S. side. We finally have a national defense strategy, which kind of outlines what our objectives are, and it's not anything new, right? The U.S. is trying to prevent China from achieving dominance in several key regions, as well as protecting the U.S. homeland and maintaining or stabilizing this sort of international order as we built it in the post-1945 era, right? So this is nothing new. We used to call it maintaining an open and free Indo-Pacific. So that's a U.S. objective. And that includes an open society and a democratic society on Taiwan. That isn't to say that that is the only component, that is the sole purpose of U.S. national strategy, especially in the Asia Pacific, but a free and open Taiwan is part of that. So that's on the U.S. side. Let's then look at the Chinese side. The Chinese Communist Party, they're probably not as transparent about what their objective is. But I think let's take for a moment an assumption here that all of the rhetoric we see about Taiwan and the importance of what they would classify reunification, I don't like that term because it's sort of a misnomer. So let's say the bringing Taiwan back into the fold, if you will. Let's assume for a moment that is in fact a high priority objective, a core objective for the Chinese Communist Party. And let's also assume that the rhetoric that we see tying the idea of national rejuvenation of China, this 2049 sort of objective of becoming a great power, let's assume for a moment that the idea of bringing Taiwan back into the fold is tied to that rejuvenation, which we do see a lot of rhetoric publicly in Chinese Communist Party documents with. So let's make those assumptions. So that's what the Chinese objective is. They ultimately want to bring Taiwan back into the fold with a very strong indication, at least publicly, of doing it by mid-century 2049. That's in 27, 28 years from now. So we have these two objectives. How does China go about achieving that, bringing Taiwan back into the fold? Well, they outline it in things like their Taiwan White Paper. We see it in action. They talk about things like cultural exchanges, more political integration, more economic integration. Those are the nice, fluffy things that they talk about. But there's also the military component. And so when those things don't work, or they feel like those things don't have the potential to work, they turn towards a military component to engage in what they would classify as military deterrent activities. I think in the US, we become hung up with this idea of military coercion or gray zone activities, you'll sometimes hear it termed as. The Chinese don't use those phrases. They call it, specifically, they called it peacetime use of military force. And if you look at the different subcategories of what that entails, one of them is explicitly called military deterrence activities. And make no mistake, even though the incident we saw in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit in August 2022, this year, and the sort of military response that China conducted after her visit, that was not the only time, even in recent history, that the People's Liberation Army, China's military, has conducted such a pressure campaign. In fact, they've been doing it on an annual and regular basis. For those of you who do watch the Asia Pacific, you'll notice that the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense is pretty good about publishing the number of flights that the Chinese Air Force conducts around Taiwan each day. Those are conducted under the auspices of a military deterrence activity that they term, it's termed in Chinese, this is a weird translation, but it's termed Station in Fujian Province Rotational Combat Deployments. And this term actually originated from the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis back in the 1950s, and they've held it ever since then, over half a century. So they've been constantly at it. And so the military option is what you use when other things aren't working to bring Taiwan into the fold. Okay, so that's a framework. Let's talk about why I don't think, or I think it will be hard to avert another crisis. I don't think the United States will abandon its policies and its sort of strategic objective of wanting to preserve the international order and a free and open Indo-Pacific, right? Unless if we had a sort of fundamental and radical change in our priorities, I don't think the US will do that. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party will abandon Taiwan as a core objective. In fact, more to the point, the Chinese Communist Party has in many ways imposed a self-inflicted moving deadline, right? If you say I need to achieve rejuvenation by 2049, you have to make incremental progress year over year. And if you don't make that incremental progress this year, you have to make it up somewhere else. That deficit has to come out of somewhere else. And so the next year or the year after that, you're going to have to make more progress. And they likely perceive that these other options, the peaceful options, the political, economic, cultural options of bringing Taiwan back into the fold aren't working. An example would be the idea that fewer and fewer people on Taiwan identify as being Chinese anymore, right? There's an increasing percentage of the Taiwanese population that identifies themselves as Taiwanese. And that's a big problem for the Chinese Communist Party because that narrative of reunification doesn't work anymore when those in Taiwan don't even see themselves as the same people. There's a whole plethora of other examples of metrics going in a bad direction as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, which leaves them, if the political and the economic and the cultural factors and informational options are not working, that leaves them with the military option. And unfortunately, we're seeing, especially under Xi Jinping, that we have seen them more willing to use more aggressive forms of military options to try to deter or coerce different political entities, whether it's Taiwan or the United States or Japan or India, to sort of acquiesce to Chinese desires or Chinese objectives. We've seen over the last 10 years they're more willing to do it, and we see them explicitly talk about being more confident in using military force, especially in this sort of gray zone. Again, I don't like that term, but in that gray zone, activity zone, they are explicitly more confident in doing that. So what does that leave us with looking into the future? I think we have to look at some different options of every time you use a military deterrence activity, you're essentially burning that option as a future thing, right? If I keep using the same thing, same threat against you, and it doesn't work, it's not going to work the future time. And if it does work this time, you're now desensitized, and that means I have to keep ratcheting it up more and more. And so the height that we've seen under Xi Jinping, the very sort of tip of escalation that we've seen, there's some debate whether it was deliberate or not, but against India, we saw limited use of lethal force in the summer of 2020. There's a border skirmish. It was unclear whether it was deliberate or not, but a couple of Chinese and Indian soldiers died in that incident. So that's sort of the height at which they've employed force. Against Taiwan, August 2022 this year was probably the height where we saw lots of missiles fires, lots of restricted military activities. But what we didn't see is sort of the hallmark of what I think we can expect to see sometime the next, I would say even next decade. That would be things like selective mobilization of parts of the country. We haven't seen China mobilize the civilian components of the country really since 1979 when they went to war with Vietnam. Doing so is incredibly painful for your economy, but it is also a very strong message to those that are watching that you're very serious about whatever you're trying to do. So I think that's an option. They can obviously expand the size and scope of what they did last time. They could involve more missiles, they can involve more ships, more aircraft. That's an obvious thing they could do. But now I want us to consider the more dangerous things they could do. One of the things they talk about is what they can do to deter other countries is what they call demonstrative strikes. That's where you actually strike targets in the desired country that you're trying to deter, sometimes with lethal effects, sometimes without lethal effects. So against Taiwan, they could put a missile into a rice paddy and say, this is a warning shot. Beware, don't push it any further. Or they could selectively target something that creates lethal effects. They could kill people, but with the intent of sending a message. And these are very viable options in their view. And so I don't think we should dismiss the possibility that those happen. And the sort of tip of what they classify as military deterrence activities is they could do something like seize one of Taiwan's offshore islands as a sort of final message to say, I, the CCP, am very serious about this. We feel like Taiwan is going in a bad direction. We need to see an immediate reverse of course. This is a message that we're very serious. Don't push it any further. And they categorize this type of activity, actually the actions they conducted against the Soviets in the 1960s, the Sino-Soviet border skirmish, those were classified as real combat deterrence activities by the PLA. And so I think we could see something like that again. So that brings us back to the original question, how can we prevent or avert another Taiwan Strait crisis? The short answer is, in order to maintain US interests, I don't think we can, but the upside to all of that is that if the US responds with commitment in sort of matches whatever the PRC is doing, or perhaps exceeds what it's doing, this is the opportunity that the US can demonstrate to the Chinese that we are very serious about our own intentions in the Asia Pacific. And although we might have a crisis, US commitment in response to that crisis might be able to avoid a full-scale war. And that's sort of the upside, is that if the US is forceful and committed to its response, the crisis might be the worst case scenario, and we can avoid that really terrifying high-end conflict that really none of us wants to have. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've got your attention, I'm sure. Okay, Andrew?
Thanks, Bob. So I guess I agree with the sentiments of the panel title, but I think the counting's off. By my count, there were 2 Taiwan Strait crises in the 50s, 1 in the 90s, and we just witnessed one several months ago. So, how do we avert a fifth would be the question. So, what's going, in the next few minutes, I want to try and answer 3 questions. What's going on? Why is it going on? And where are we headed? First, to be blunt, I think Taiwan is now ground zero in strategic competition between the US and China. And since the relationship between Washington and Beijing is now fraught, there's a corresponding rise in tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So, what's the background here? Well, there have been multiple serial Taiwan Strait crises. Taiwan's long been the most contentious issue in US-China relations. It's been a flashpoint since the 1950s. The issue set aside since 1971 to permit rapprochement and then normalization at the end of that decade, and then in subsequent decades set aside in order to sustain a relationship that both sides saw as mutually beneficial. Yet the issue of Taiwan was never settled nor solved, and the status quo has been left ambiguous. Indeed, both sides cannot agree on what the status quo is, but what they can agree on is the other side is changing it. But that's part of the problem. What is the status quo? Both sides have different perceptions of what that is. So where are we headed? I think it's getting harder and harder for Washington and Beijing to handle. Each side perceiving the other, as I mentioned, as altering the status quo. And I think Beijing appears to be at or close to a tipping point. What do I mean by this? I mean, three things. That China's communist leaders, most importantly, Xi Jinping, have concluded, or close to concluding, one of three, or the three following things. First, that the strategy of peaceful unification has failed. Second, the trends, as Rod alluded to, are going in the wrong direction where Taiwan's concerned. They're moving towards independence and away from unification. And three, that the use of force cannot be avoided. So that said, a careful reading of Xi Jinping's work report to the 20th Party Congress a few weeks ago, it's inconclusive. If you try and read read between the lines, whether that tipping point that I mentioned has been reached or not. This doesn't necessarily, even if Beijing's reached that conclusion that the previous policy has failed and things are moving in the wrong direction and the use of force can't be avoided, that doesn't necessarily mean that Beijing is pursuing unification on, quote, a much faster timeline, as a senior U.S. official mentioned a few weeks ago, actually Secretary of State Blinken. But even if Beijing has reached a tipping point, this doesn't mean that war or invasion is imminent, or that a decision to use force on a specific timeline has been reached. However, it does mean that military conflict over Taiwan is much more likely, because each side distrusts the other. One is prone to misinterpret the signals of the other, and the two can very easily get caught up in escalation spirals. So this is, achieving national rejuvenation has now been linked explicitly with realizing unification. So that's both in the defense, in Xi Jinping's work report and also in the latest Taiwan white paper. So no deadlines have been publicly identified, but I think it's significant that national rejuvenation, or making China great again, has been clearly associated with achieving unification. And as Rob was saying, 2049, it's a long way away. Probably a lot of people in this room won't be on this planet anymore. Probably neither will Xi Jinping. But it's it's still a psychological, exerts some psychological pressure on China's communist rulers. So let me close by suggesting three things to monitor closely in the coming months and years. First, how the situation in Ukraine plays out. Conflict or war termination, it's likely to, there's no sign that there's going to be any quick conclusion to that, but China is watching and taking lessons from that, and probably not learning the lessons that we hope they're learning. But we can talk about that in the Q&A. Second thing to watch is China's economic trajectory. Slowing growth rates, and one can't rule out a recession in China or worse, but that will also affect the calculus in Beijing vis-a-vis Taiwan and also regarding U.S.-China relations. The third thing to watch is the lead up to and the aftermath of Taiwan's elections scheduled for January of 2024. So 2024 will be a big year election-wise, not just in the U.S., but in Taiwan, and Beijing is watching. So the outcome of that election those elections in January of 2024 are difficult to predict. In real democracies, the outcomes are not known. If you have in rigged democracies, the way that what we saw at the Party Congress and what we're going to see at the National People's Congress in March of next year, the outcome of those elections are not in any doubt at all. But the key in these three, watching those three items, monitoring those three items, is, of course, how Beijing assesses each and responds. But each will, I suggest, influence Beijing's calculus vis-a-vis Taiwan. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now it's my turn to spend a few minutes with you about looking at the domestic U.S. situation and dealing with this issue. And this involves the debate that took place in the United States after the Pelosi visit took place. We had a very active debate for several weeks about U.S.-China relations and the danger of war and this sort of thing. And so to understand that, I think one needs to understand what is driving the United States to be so harsh against China after decades of engagement. And the force here that I think is very important to explain is what we call the Washington Consensus about China. This emerged in the Trump administration by his people and his national security strategy. He laid this out in December of 2017, but nobody paid attention to it. The media and so forth ignored it. Public opinion didn't register at all. But the Congress did. And bipartisan majorities in the Congress agree with this, that we need a much tougher approach to China. And so those majorities bipartisan majorities, have continued their efforts over the last 5 years now with both the Trump administration people and with the Biden administration, pursuing a much tougher policy toward China because they see three clusters of major challenges posed by China. There are security challenges, there are economic challenges, and there are governance challenges, so many of them. And they're basically trying to defend America against these challenges. And so this is the motive that's driven this kind of policy, which continues today. Now, what we find in this situation is that this year, you've seen a lot of success in this effort. And so the efforts in Congress and the administration to get tougher, to put the restrictions on China, and to set up frameworks and programs that will be very effective in countering the Chinese challenges have been successfully carried out. We thought, for example, that the Ukraine situation would lead to diversion of U.S. attention away from China. That didn't happen. What happened was that people paid more attention to the Chinese connection with Putin and therefore became even more resolved to continue their approach of countering China's challenges. And of course, the Europeans came along with the United States more as a result of this as well. And then later on, we have major legislation passed with the CHIPS and Science Act. Tens of billions of dollars are going into programs to compete with China in high technology. And then we have the anti-inflation law of 2022, which is heavily focused on climate change, and it's designed to do all sorts of things in the United States, and it's very focused against China. And there are a whole slew of other things. So the Pelosi flap, if you will, her visit and the crisis that emerged after that came in this context. And so we had a debate. And the Washington Consensus, that is the administration leaders and the Congress, they were firm. They didn't blink, really. And then you had the debate, though. The debate was, it's too extreme, It was dangerous and so forth. And so they wanted changes in the policy. And what happened? What happened was the administration continued to do what it was doing. It started trade negotiations with Taiwan. It said, we're going to give $1.1 billion more arms to Taiwan. It sent cruisers into the Taiwan Straits rather than the usual destroyers in patrolling the Taiwan Strait. In Congress, what did they do? They were signing up for delegations to go to Taiwan. They would one after another doing this sort of thing. So there was no budge. Mr. Biden goes in television. He says, if it comes to this, the U.S. will defend Taiwan. This is very firm situation. And so what you find here is, as a result of this kind of situation, and of course then Mr. Biden came up with this national security strategy, and he has this imposition of restrictions on high technology computer chip technology, which is really kneecapping China's capacities in this area. So this really hurts. So therefore, we have to pay attention then what is going to happen. The bottom line here is that this Washington consensus is no longer passive in the face of all these challenges China poses. What's that going to mean? It's going to mean China is going to be angry, that tensions are going to rise, and people say we're moving toward a Cold War. And this is very, very difficult to situate. So this is broader than just Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is part of this, but it's broader than that. And so that's what's happening. And so the key thing to watch is, what is China doing? And what I see is very interesting, and this hasn't come up in our discussion because it really just happened this week. We had a summit meeting between Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi, and they agreed to work out some arrangements. The U.S. for a year at least has been trying to get the Chinese to begin dialogues with the United States to manage these tensions. We know there's going to be more tensions. We're moving into a Cold War-like situation with competition with China. And so how do we manage the tensions so we avoid war and conflict? And so the U.S. says, and the Chinese wouldn't do it. The Chinese said, no, you have to change your policy first. And Taiwan policy was number one of what had to be changed. They said this repeatedly. And what did Xi Jinping do? He put that aside. He just put it aside. And he said, we need to have this engagement. And so he met with Biden, and then everything became so positive in the relationship. The foreign minister of China did a press conference after this summit meeting in which he went on about how we need to do this sort of thing, this is really necessary, and so forth. I mean, he sounded just like Blinken, only better, you know, in this. No, it was amazing to see. And he says, and this is what he said, we should not have these lists of requirements of the other side. Well, the Chinese have been giving us lists for a whole year. And he said this, his foreign minister had been doing it, but he just ignored that. And so we're in this kind of situation now. And so if you're an advocate of the Washington consensus, you say, yes, we have to be firm. It's underlying what Rod said, what you have to do. You have to be firm. And you do this carefully, of course. But you show the other side it's not in their interest to do these bad things. And I think this administration has done that. I think they have to look at the situation, at least for now, as a win. They've done something quite constructive, it seems to me. Now, we have to, how long will this play out? I'm not going to be overly optimistic about this, how far this will go. But for now, this is a much better situation than we were, say, 2 weeks ago. And I think the communications are now taking place. We're going to have more dialogues and so forth. But I do think the Washington consensus, the people, the Congress, the people I deal with in the Congress, and I think it's very broad, and the administration, they're firm. They're very firm. And they are, and they're not stupid, if you see what I mean. They know. And I think it works. I think it has worked in this instance, at least temporarily. So I wanted to end on a note of a little optimism as a result of that. I think just look at what Xi Jinping's been saying. It's like he forgot about what he said at the party Congress. He was very tough, struggle, so forth. Now it's all accommodation. Let's work it out. This kind of thing. It's a remarkable shift in tone, and that didn't happen because the U.S. offered concessions. It happened because the U.S. was firm. Okay, so we'll stop there. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, and the spotlight is a little, I can't see that mic too well, but let's, yeah, okay. We'll take maybe we'll take 2 questions at a time, and if you're addressing them, identify yourself, and addressing them to a panelist, please be clear about that. So we'll start here, and then we'll go over there.
Sure. My name is Ron Thompson. I'm with the Tennessee World Affairs Council, and this question is really to anyone that wants to take it. I like to begin with analysis first of China's economy. We see that they are one of the largest economies in the world. They are great at mass production while staying relatively cheap. Yet I think you can make the argument that China has not made an original product that's been especially noticeable in the last decade. Yes, they are good at producing what we can produce, but at a larger scale and cheaper. But I think that's sort of a testament to, while their economy is very large, I don't know how stable it is. But looking at Taiwan, one of the 4 Asian tigers alongside Hong Kong, which I think is in a similar position to Taiwan.
Try to be brief, if you could.
Yeah,
please.
I'm wrapping it up. We see that they have their industries are over more modern avenues, such as semiconductor manufacturing, which plays a large role into other industries. So in your opinion, collectively, what is the overall economic impact of continued Chinese aggression towards Taiwan if Hong Kong can serve as any indicator? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman, person over here.
Hello, my name is Tulsi. I'm a student scholar from the Dallas World Affairs Council. And as someone who's South Asian and has dealt with post-earthquake infrastructure, I wanted to ask any one of the panelists to talk about how China has used infrastructure and diplomacy, specifically in South Asia and on the African continent, to supersede America in diplomacy. Often I see them outperforming USAID and things of that nature, so I was interested in learning about that and how this could also be applicable to the situation in Taiwan.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody want to take either one?
Yeah, I'll take a shot on the econ one. So caveat, I'm not an economist, so this is sort of me just making things up almost. Hopefully there are not a lot of economists in here. So my sense is that, yes, aggression over, whether it's Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, you name it. Like, aggression, especially when you start getting to the more escalatory rungs of the ladder that we're more likely to see in the future years, is going to be bad for economic growth on all fronts. Historically, that has been sort of the one thing I think a lot of folks in the United States have leaned on in saying, okay, this is why we think China won't go big or won't use higher rungs of the escalation ladder, because it's bad for the economy. And that's sort of the penultimate argument often about why China would never, or almost certainly would not, invade or use some other form of forceful means to bring Taiwan back into the fold. The argument is that the repercussions of that, and it is just so catastrophic for the Chinese economy that it would be a death blow. And historically, I think there was probably a strong argument for that, and that's probably still, almost certainly still the case today. And therefore, the lower rungs of the ladder would also be bad economically for China, as well as Taiwan and the United States, you name it. The issue with all of that, though, is that if we do a little bit of tea leaf reading of recent Chinese Communist Party documents, they appear to be less interested about economic growth versus a more abstract idea of national security. And that's sort of a concerning trend, is that it suggests, it's not to say that they don't care about the economy anymore, but it suggests that they're willing to tolerate more pain in exchange for other abstract things associated with national security. One of those almost certainly is the idea of making substantive progress on the Taiwan issue. So yeah, it's bad for the economy, but my concern is I don't think they care as much as they used to anymore. So should we pay attention to it? Absolutely. Should we put as much weight on it anymore? I don't think so.
Great. And then how about the infrastructure? Andrew, you want to say something about that?
But just to add to what Rob was saying, I tend to agree, and that's why I'm a little more pessimistic than Bob is. But Bob's been at this a lot longer than I have, so I think his words should carry more weight than mine. But on the question of diplomacy and infrastructure, I want to focus on South Asia in particular because it's a pretty interesting story. So the Chinese have this term, 经济外交, so literally economic diplomacy, and economics is important, but the diplomatic part of it is important too. And of course, where infrastructure is concerned, China's been exporting capacity because they basically built as much infrastructure as they can domestically, and they're looking to export that. And so even before the Belt and Road Initiative was launched, it was going on. But of course, this has been Xi Jinping's flagship foreign policy initiative. For some reason, it's not as widely hyped now. I'm not sure why, but I suspect it's because it's hit some bumps in the roads. There have been some bridges to nowhere. There have been some problems. But where South Asia is concerned, it's a really interesting case because you have two countries, India and Pakistan. India is the one notable country, one of the notable countries in the world, one of the few to opt out of Belt and Road. And I'll explain why in a minute. Pakistan, India's neighbor, and obviously there's a contentious relationship between the two, by contrast has been the single most focus of more investment in Belt and Road projects than any other country in the world. So South Asia has so why did India opt out? Well, two reasons they gave officially. One was on a matter of principle that the contracts for these Belt and Road projects are not transparent. So how they're made, what the loans involve, and so-called, which raises concerns about debt trap diplomacy. That's one aspect. The other, so that was a matter of principle, why India opted out. The other was a matter of national interest, which is some of those projects in Pakistan were actually being, were located on disputed territories that were claimed by both India and Pakistan. So in a sense where South Asia is concerned, you have in microcosm a cautionary tale on the pros and cons of China's approach to engaging with the world, leveraging economics to advance its interests.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's take a question here and a question here, please.
All right. Hi, my name is Evan Odegaard. I'm a student here with World Boston. So the U.S. is able to be bold in its support for Taiwan, but how should countries that are more economically dependent on China, like Australia or other Asian or African countries, approach their Taiwan policy?
Okay, and question over here?
Yeah, Mary Mendoza for World Boston. We did not coordinate this, by the way. Ukraine has done an amazing job fighting against Russia. Has that inspired the Chinese to reverse? My understanding is that they decreased a lot of their defense spending, and they now have quite a small military. Has that inspired them to change their way and say, wait, if the Ukrainians can do it, maybe we can hold off the Chinese too?
Has Ukraine changed Taiwan's?
Yeah, their tremendous ability to hold off the Russians, which
Right.
are supposedly.
But
the
you're looking at
second largest.
Taiwan's capacity, right?
Yeah, I'm looking
Right.
to see.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. The Ukraine-Taiwan thing seems, you guys are good at that. So why don't we start with that?
So it's been, I don't think, to my knowledge, Taiwan has not had a substantive shift in the amount of money they spend whether it's in response to Ukraine or not. There is a general sort of view within Taiwan society as a whole. I think that national defense is becoming more of a critical issue. Historically, Taiwan has shifted away from a conscription force and tried to move to an all-volunteer force. That has had issues in trying to get people to actually join to meet volunteer quotas. So I don't know if the numbers have been released yet, but that might help bridge that gap. And there is, I think, a general consensus within Taiwan that there's a lot of utility in sort of what Ukraine has managed to do against Russia in terms of whether it's denying airspace to the Russians. They say, okay, we can try to do something similar with the Chinese. The utility of low-cost precision munitions, anti-tank guided missiles, drones, you name it. They say, okay, this all applies to the fight against China as well. The major factor that I think everyone ties, okay, what is a lesson learned here? Taiwan's an island, and there isn't a rail line running from Poland into Ukraine for Taiwan, right? Like the most that the Taiwanese can hope for in the event of a conflict is the United States to bring in aircraft into the eastern part of the country. There's a couple of airfields or airports that the U.S. could plausibly use, assuming those haven't been destroyed, assuming that the ports are almost certainly all going to be destroyed. So we're really counting on this tiny trickle of stuff to get into Taiwan to combat an invasion or whatever you may say the issue is. That's sort of the fundamental difference, or one of the fundamental differences. The other fundamental difference is that Ukraine has geographic depth, right? Like Ukraine is a big country, and you can sort of sacrifice or draw enemy forces in and employ asymmetric advantages that they have been so successful in employing against the Russians. The Taiwanese don't have that. Like, it's a small island with a very small population that just doesn't have the defensive depth that Ukraine does. And so it doesn't have the luxury of allowing the Chinese to come in. They essentially have to defeat, as far as the Taiwan military is concerned, they essentially have to defeat the invasion on the beaches. And if that doesn't happen, they're in big time trouble. And that's a pretty fundamental difference from what Ukraine is doing. So I think, yes, there are some tactical lessons learned, but there's some pretty big operational and strategic differences between what we're seeing in Taiwan, in Ukraine, and what Taiwan might get out of it. Andrew.
Great.
Tackle the other question?
Do you want to do that, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So as far as advising other countries on their Taiwan policy, I won't presume to tell other countries what they should or shouldn't do. But I think what's interesting is, you mentioned Australia. In 2016, before our election, in the summer of 2016, the winter in Australia, I was down interviewing Australians, a cross-section of academics and think tankers and officials, and sort of message they were trying to get across to me was that the U.S., America, don't do anything stupid, because they were worried that in particular focused on the South China Sea, that the U.S. might be pushing the envelope and goading China, and that might trigger a war. And guess who would have to be, would be forced to choose whether they support their ally, the United States. Of course, it would be Australia. So that was the feeling then, that they were worried about what the U.S. might do. Fast forward a few years, that has fundamentally changed. Why? Because of what China's been doing. So most countries, including Australia, are now clearly see China as a threat, and they're much more aligned with U.S. thinking about how to counter China, but of course in ways that can avoid unintended escalation and unwanted conflict. But so I think it's really, the good news is if we see more positive signs, the ones following from the signs that Bob mentioned in recent days, then I think countries like Australia and the U.S. will change, adjust their policies accordingly. But it's really up to what China does or doesn't do.
Very good. Okay, we have a question over here and one over here, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Helena Hardy, and I'm representing the upstate of South Carolina, and I'm a student scholar here. So this goes along with what you were just saying, but a lot of the rhetoric appears to be a dichotomy of the U.S. versus China. However, we've seen sort of an ideological unification, especially in the wake of China's tacit support of the invasion of Ukraine against China. Therefore, moving forward, do you believe that a firm U.S. commitment to responding to Taiwan is something that it can or will do alone? Or how do you see major powers making more of a collaborative international effort?
Okay, and over here?
Mine is related to Taiwan too, maybe a little more tactical. My name is Ed Martins with World Boston, and it'd be very difficult to do an invasion of Taiwan. Sea invasions are incredibly difficult from a military point of view. What if they do a blockade? They could blockade it. They say this is our waters. Their Navy is pretty strong. We could probably beat it if we had to, but would we? I mean, if they do a blockade, now that seems to me the most likely possibility if they're going to do it. What would we do then? What do you think what are our options? Thank you.
Okay, the blockade option has been around for a while. Some of us have been looking at that for decades, but folks, yeah, please.
I'll take a crack at the blockade question. In many ways, the blockade option against Taiwan is probably the more terrifying of the options because it is the more difficult thing for the United States to beat. To your point, there's a geographic advantage. The Chinese Navy, the Chinese military writ large is probably more comfortable going toe-to-toe in sort of a maritime environment against the United States, plus partners and allies, than the more difficult amphibious invasion. So that's why it is, in fact, I think, the more difficult operational consideration for the Department of Defense to look at that is getting a lot of attention, but probably not as much as attention as it should be. And I used to be probably a really big proponent of taking the blockade threat seriously, and I continue to be a pretty big proponent. Because currently I don't think there's a lot that the United States can do. Because in order to break a blockade, you either have to you need to somehow get stuff into the country. And the US doesn't have the merchant fleet to get stuff into the country. We just don't have enough ships. And it is incredibly easy, comparatively speaking, for the Chinese military to destroy any ports of debarkation that might be used to offload things to sort of alleviate the island, airports as well. So I think it's a very difficult problem set that there isn't a good solution to. But the reason I'm sort of flipping back on that is I think there is a significant time component associated with using force against Taiwan to bring them back into the fold. And that time component, I think, I have no proof of this, but I think as they watch Ukraine, they say, if we give the international community more time to waffle about and make its mind up, it may not respond forcefully in a week or 2 weeks, but after a month or two, the response might be have greater effects, negative effects against China. And if I am trying to minimize that, I, as China, have to go very fast. And it may be the expensive and the more difficult operational option, but strategically, it makes more sense because I will have to deal with less economic and diplomatic backlash. Because if I've already created the conditions to take Taiwan, if I've already taken Taiwan in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, then that doesn't give the international community time to cook on it and sort of figure out whether they want to respond or not.
Good.
So I think there are those two dynamics at play.
Andrew, on either one, either comment?
Yeah, on the second question, I'm going to maybe not answer the question the way you hoped I might. I think it is about U.S. versus China, and excuse me, there are certainly other countries involved, but especially on a Taiwan scenario, it is U.S. versus China. I mean, the good news is neither side wants a conflict. China and China, for further to Rod's point, I think the Chinese military don't think they're ready, and they're actually quite honest about the problems there. And so thoroughgoing reforms that happen, they're still a work in progress. Like, it's basically, one way of putting it is China's gold, water's nickels. It's how can they create a truly joint force to fight high-tech warfare, informatized warfare, and they're not there yet. And of course the U.S., I'm coming from the U.S. Institute of Peace, so we believe in peace. and so how do we avoid, I think that's the larger question, not who's going to line up with us. That's, should the balloon go up? That's not an unimportant question, but the larger question is how do we avoid war? And I think that's really fundamentally up to the U.S. and China, and it gets to the question of signaling, clear signaling, and good communication, good constant communication. And so that's why I'm hopeful when Bob mentioned some hopeful signs that we're going to see more interaction. Let me give you a very quick example of the problems in misinterpretation and miscommunication. On day one of the Biden administration, a spokesperson from the National Security Council said at a press conference, the U.S. commitment, U.S. relationship to Taiwan is rock solid. They used that term, rock solid. And and other officials subsequently used that in the next few days and weeks. So what was the purpose of using that term? It was to try and signal to China that there was no change in the policy with on Taiwan from the previous administration. Because there were some hope, wishful thinking in Beijing that there might be a more accommodating, Biden administration might be more accommodating than the previous administration. How did China take that rock solid? Well, first of all, it was a new term. And in Chinese political culture and diplomacy, terms are very important because they're carefully chosen on the Chinese side, and they assume that the other side is carefully choosing their terms too. So a new term like rock solid comes out, and the Chinese are saying, well, what does this mean? It must mean, they assume the worst, that this means there's a qualitative upgrading of America's relationship with Taiwan. I think that feeds into the Pelosi visit, which again was interpreted on the Chinese side on this narrative that this is a change. Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions. I really am sorry about that. And I was going to try to take them quickly, but the time has run out. And so we will be happy to stick around and answer questions as you wish. We do have the option now of each speaker has time for a concluding comment. And so let's start with Rod, and then Andrew, and then I'll make my comment. There's just a 1 minute wrap up.
My concluding comment is I don't think a war is inevitable, but I do think getting there avoiding that requires something that is distasteful to us in the short term. A sort of in-the-middle crisis response that may resemble in some ways a limited conflict might be the way to avoid the full-blown war. And although that's something we don't like to do in the United States, that might be one of the options, and I think we shouldn't dismiss it and sort of avoid crises at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Andrew?
Well, in the words of Kevin Rudd, who's the president of the Asia Society and the former Prime Minister of Australia, I fear we're in a decade of living dangerously with China. Now, that doesn't mean we're in a war, but we could stumble into one. And so I think future crises in the Taiwan Strait are probably unavoidable, but hopefully manageable. But we've got to pay attention, and it really requires everyone in this room and outside to really do their homework and monitor the situation, because if we don't, I fear we really could stumble into a conflict, unwanted conflict with China.
Good advice. Just in conclusion on my part, I think understanding the domestic element in the United States, these challenges that China poses to the United States are seen as very important. They're existential dangers. The one about in Asia, China will dominate Asia, that's seen as a major threat to the United States if that happens. The United States has worked against that for 100 years. And so it's very important for the United States. Secondly, in the high technology area, if China dominates high technology, they'll dominate the economy of the future, and they'll dominate the military of the future because the militaries are so dependent on high technology. So the sense of urgency that you see in the Washington Consensus, when I've seen it for 5 years, it's a very powerful force. And so what does this mean? The pushback against Chinese challenges will continue. And I tell my students this, and they don't like to hear it. They're more optimistic, and they want to fix things. And I say, well, this one is going to be tense. But coming from the Cold War, it was tense all the time. I'm sure some of you remember this. Everything was an issue. And they had 30,000 nuclear warheads aimed at American targets. And so this is a very different, so we're in this kind of situation, and we need effective management of the issues. And the point I tried to make is that this administration and the Congress are basically doing okay. It's working to some degree, and it's managing it. It's not solving it by any means. It's managing it. So I think we can conclude on that note.